Welcome, everybody, to tonight's webinar. We have Kate Prince here with us tonight. She is our project manager for the Caribou project, and she's going to be talking tonight about year 2, 2025, and what to expect there. Enjoy, and there will be time for questions and answers at the end. You can also type your questions into the chat, and we'll try to address those. Thank you so much, and we'll let Kate take it over.
Thanks, MJ. I understand that you didn't have any sound on those slides playing there. So I'm just going to make sure that I've got sound shared before we get started so that everything else works all right. Okay, hopefully I'll check when the first video plays, but that should work now. So thanks everyone for joining us to launch the second year of the project. As MJ said, my name is Kate. I'm the project manager for the Wabakimi Boreal Caribou Citizen Monitoring Project. Happy to see you all tonight as we continue on with this important effort. The Wabakimi area is the ancestral land of the Anishinaabe peoples, who have cared for these lands and waters, all of its beings since time immemorial. The area where the Caribou Project is taking place is within the territories of Treaty 3, Treaty 9, and the Robinson Superior Treaty, and we respectfully acknowledge the relationship that Indigenous communities have with their ancestral lands and waters, and with the caribou as the original stewards of biodiversity. We know we have a great deal to learn from that ongoing relationship. Friends of Wabakimi has committed to learning about Indigenous histories and present-day realities, to listening to and amplifying Indigenous voices, and we wish to take respectful and collaborative action to move meaningfully towards reconciliation. I'm going to cover a lot of ground this evening. For those of you who are brand new to the project, we'll hope to get you up to speed on what it's all about. So we'll start off with a little caribou background, biology, and then move on to why we're doing this work, how it fits into greater conservation efforts, and then, of course, dive into the survey trips and what is involved in volunteering this year in the second year of the project. As I mentioned, this is the second year of a total of 3 years of survey activities. The goals of the project are to empower and train wilderness paddlers to gather evidence of boreal caribou present in the Wabakimi area. So that means recruiting volunteers and sending folks out on canoe trips to search for and document evidence of caribou. The data that we collect is submitted to policymakers and made available to conservation professionals to inform and guide caribou recovery efforts in the coming years. And finally, there's an education aspect of the project. We're building interest and awareness of caribou conservation and citizen science through education amongst paddlers involved in the efforts, as well as hopefully more broadly than that. So the very basics, what are boreal caribou? There's several names for caribou around the world in different places. When you think of caribou, you may picture the big herds of migratory caribou in the far north, like the porcupine caribou herd, or in northern Quebec, we've got the George River herd that some of you may have been even fortunate enough to encounter on a canoe trip. But what exactly are boreal caribou? So to start with the basics, caribou are a medium-sized ungulate, member of the deer family. They're found throughout the circumpolar north. So you've heard of reindeer in Northern Europe and Russia, domesticated reindeer in Scandinavia. We got these guys. They're all the same species. So these are all Rangifer tarandus. However, the various subspecies found around the north do have some different characteristics. So the subspecies that we're looking at is woodland caribou, Rangifer tarandus caribou, which are located within the green range on the map in Canada. That's from nearly coast to coast. And an even further distinction, which brings us to boreal caribou, is the ecotype breakdown. So in Ontario, the non-migratory forest-dwelling caribou within this sort of central band, the darker band on the map in Northern Ontario, are boreal caribou. Caribou are exceptionally well adapted to life in the boreal forest. If you've ever seen a caribou swimming, you'll have noticed that they float really high in the water with their back sitting almost along the surface of the water. You can often see part of their back as they swim. They have hollow hair, which gives them excellent buoyancy and which, again, perfectly adapted for the boreal forest, land of lakes and rivers, and this hollow fur traps air both within their coat, but also inside the individual hairs, creating exceptional insulation for cold winter climates. They are also adapted for walking on soft ground, like the peatlands in Northern Ontario, and in deep snow with their large rounded hooves that act like snowshoes. They will also use their hooves to dig for lichen in the snow, as this is their preferred food source throughout year-round. The name caribou comes from a French or Mi'kmaq word, calipu, which means the one who paws or snow shoveler. And of course, they're named for their ability to dig through the snow to access that lichen in the winter. And then finally, these are, again, as I mentioned, not the big herd animals of the far north. They do remain in smaller groups of typically under 15 animals in the winter, and they tend to be even more solitary in the summer months, which helps them to avoid predators and find safe calving areas. Caribou thrive in mature upland, boreal forest areas that are rich in lichens, peatlands, and muskeg. Despite their low density, they do require large tracts of land in this mature forest to support their population. What these large tracts of forest do is allow caribou to disperse across their range successfully, even when conditions are unfavorable. So if there's a disturbance caused by natural means like fire or blowdowns or insect damage, or anthropogenic disturbance like forestry or mining activity, it allows them to spread out to avoid predators and move to appropriate habitat during different times of year, such as during calving season. In terms of predation, caribou become more vulnerable to predators when they're sharing their habitat with other prey animals like moose that attract those predators. Moose thrive in younger, regenerating forests, but caribou need that intact, mature forest. So you can sort of picture this situation where forestry activities occur in caribou habitat in that mature forest. The area begins to regenerate. More moose are then attracted to that area and move into the area, followed by wolves, which increases the chance of encounters between caribou and wolves within that habitat area. Caribou calving season is May and June. So during calving season, pregnant females will travel solo to remote areas, those being islands, peninsulas, or sometimes wetlands, to give birth in late spring, early summer. And then the cow and calf will remain in that area, which is relatively safe for them as the calf grows over the summer months. So I'll go back for just a moment to the project's goal of focusing on calving areas for a minute. The reason for this is caribou are known to use the same calving areas, either groups of islands or even one island in particular, for many, many years. So identifying and protecting historic calving grounds is important, as these are places where caribou will return to, seeking safety for calving as over a number of years. And finally, caribou have a low rate of reproduction. Unlike moose or deer, the rate of giving birth to twins is extremely low in caribou. So once a female reaches reproductive age of 3 years, they are typically rearing only one calf every year. So why are we undertaking this project? Well, why caribou specifically? Boreal caribou are listed as threatened both federally since 2003 and provincially since 2008, when the Species at Risk Act took effect in Ontario. Threatened status means that the population numbers have decreased to a size that they will continue to decline until some action is taken to reduce the threats to a population. Currently, the population of caribou across Ontario as a whole is estimated to be at about 5,000. Historically, Caribou ranged as far south as Algonquin Park in Ontario, and Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, even into New York and Vermont in the United States. Their range in Ontario has been reduced by 40 to 50% since the late 1800s. Threats to caribou is not a new concern. The alarm was being raised about declining caribou populations as early as 1949, but it's become a much more prescient issue in more recent years. The most significant threat to the caribou population in the Wabakimi area continues to be habitat disturbance and degradation due to resource extraction, logging, mining, road building, and on top of that, there is increased predation, as I was mentioning, caused as a result of that habitat disturbance. Caribou are able to withstand a certain level of disturbance within their range. At this point in time, few of Ontario's caribou ranges are considered self-sustaining, and they're likely to continue to decline without some kind of intervention or change within that habitat. And I'll come back to this more in just a minute. The last point is that caribou are described as an umbrella species, meaning that protecting caribou results in overall improved health of the boreal forest ecosystem. This quote from Environment and Climate Change Canada sort of sums up how protecting caribou protects the greater ecosystem. It says, protection of the boreal caribou's critical habitat is expected to improve outcomes for 80 other listed species at risk, benefit 90% of the birds and mammal species that live in the boreal forest, and provide protection of soil carbon hotspots. So protecting caribou habitat benefits other threatened species like wolverine, many threatened or at-risk boreal breeding songbirds, because it means intact and healthy ecosystems for those species as well. And it also means forestry activities are taking place at a level that's sustainable for the forest. And the benefits to protecting caribou go beyond species at risk. Again, as pointed out here, it also means limiting climate impacts by keeping those massive carbon sinks intact in the boreal ecosystem. And I'll also point out that what's good for caribou is also good for paddlers, and it's the thing that brings us into contact with caribou occasionally, which is those large tracts of undisturbed wilderness, the healthy ecosystems, and the wildlife that comes with that. And those things that many of us have appreciated as paddlers as well. So that gives you a bit of context for why we just can't let those issues that caribou face just slip by unnoticed. So just to get our bearings, for those of you less familiar with Wabakimi or who haven't been there, the place marker in the center indicates Wabakimi Provincial Park, 240 kilometers north of Thunder Bay, Ontario. And the park makes up 892,000 hectares at the core of the wilderness area. The Wabakimi area, as defined by the Friends of Wabakimi, also includes Crown land and other parks and conservation reserves outside of Wabakimi Provincial Park for a total of 2.5 million hectares. So that's about 6 times bigger than the Boundary Waters canoe area, for those of you who are familiar with that area, or 3.5 times bigger than Algonquin Park. So it's really quite a massive area. Our project is targeting lakes within the Crown land areas outside of the park, perhaps overlapping into the park in a couple of places, but mostly outside, to the west, south, and southeast of Wabakimi Provincial Park. You'll notice that in our reports and presentations, we won't give or identify specific lake names or places where we're looking for or where we've found evidence of caribou. And the reason for that is to minimize disturbance to the animals, particularly at that time in the summer when in areas that caribou are calving and rearing their young when they are the most sensitive to disturbance at that time. Very briefly, I want to put this in context of how caribou are being managed more broadly. So across Canada, the boreal caribou population is divided into 51 ranges for the purposes of assessment and management. So conservation efforts can then be tailored, and changes to the population can be assessed and monitored in different locations that face different degrees or different types of threats. Caribou experts and scientists have determined that in order for a caribou population to remain self-sustaining, the caribou can only tolerate habitat disturbance in up to 35% of their range. And by tolerate is a bit of a almost an overstatement. By that, I mean at 35% disturbance, they have a 60% chance of having a self-sustaining population. If over 35% is disturbed, this poses a pretty significant threat to the population there. So I'll come back to this more in just a second. When we zero in on Ontario, you can see this little orange circle that I've drawn there. The ranges where our project is taking place are called the Bright Sand and Nipigon ranges within that orange circle. And on the next slide, we'll just zoom in on those. So these maps show those two ranges, the Bright Sand range on the left, and on the right is the Nipigon range. The maps come from a Government of Ontario report from 6 years ago that assessed the state of the caribou ranges in the province. And I'll explain to you what you're looking at. If you remember that previous map, you can recall that, of course, these two maps do go together and make up one contiguous area in Ontario. The dark blue is water, the most obvious feature being Lake Nipigon in the bottom left corner of the Nipigon range map. The light blue is areas of anthropogenic or human-made disturbance, and the red is natural disturbance. So most often that would be fire activity. Now, Wabakimi Provincial Park is located mostly within the northern part of the Bright Sand Range on the left. If you look very closely, those of you familiar with the park will be able to make out Wabakimi Lake, pointing at the left arrow there, Whitewater Lake towards the center, and just into the Nipigon Range, there's White Clay Lake. So if you imagine the main body of the park surrounding those lakes, and for those of you who are less familiar, you can the park sort of covers up most of that area that has white in the background of the map. So you can see how there's much less disturbance in that area than in the areas to the south. And you can picture how caribou face a pretty significant threat when they start to venture outside the park. And then finally, you'll remember that number of 35% disturbance threshold that I mentioned. So starting on the left-hand map, the Bright Sand Range, unfortunately, it's been assessed at a disturbance of 43.5%, and the Nipigon Range at 39.3%. So in both areas, the caribou population is under significant pressure from habitat disturbance, and so that's what brings us here. So the data that we collect from our survey trips is submitted annually to Ontario's Natural Heritage Information Centre, the NHIC, a branch of the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources that is responsible for maintaining a provincial record of species at risk. And the NHIC can then share that information in this database to support conservation and forest management decisions across Ontario. Our database is also can be made available to conservation professionals to help guide the protection of boreal caribou, and allows the Friends of Wabakimi to make informed comments backed by data during the forest management planning processes in the managed forest areas in the future. So as this is the second year of the project we're getting into, just to set the stage, I'm going to give you the 10-second summary of what we accomplished last year. If you're interested in diving deeper into those details, you can check out the FOW website for the year one results report and the results webinar. There's lots more details there for you. So in 2024, we did conduct 3 survey trips to 3 different target lakes. 13 people participated, and in total, we conducted 82 surveys. Our teams last year found evidence of caribou at 21 survey points. So this graph shows the number of sites where evidence was found, not the quantity of that evidence, just the number of sites. The most common evidence was pellets or scat, which we couldn't anticipate. They were found at 2/3 of the sites that had evidence of caribou. There were 5 sites that had multiple types of evidence. So, for example, bedding area also often included pellets. And surveyors observed caribou tracks at 8 sites. We did not find any antlers, but most excitingly, of course, at 2 sites, there were 3 individual caribou that were spotted. And so with that, we arrive here at the second year of the project. So this summer, we plan to conduct at least 5 to 6 survey trips, which will involve up to 24 volunteers, potentially more than that. We'll be focusing on new target lake areas that will be located again outside of the park on Crown land and accessed, most likely accessed from the Armstrong area. And we'll continue to promote the use of iNaturalist for paddlers who are not involved in our surveys to report evidence of caribou that they find on their own personal trips in the Wabakimi area. So I know many of you are interested in volunteering, or I know I've received applications from some of you. Thank you very much for that. To set the stage for those of you who are curious about volunteering and those who are wondering what a trip might be like, I want to play a short video that shares a little bit about what the survey trip experience was like for some of our volunteers last summer. And the video is about 7 minutes long, so I'll let that play, and then we'll get into the details about volunteering and what is involved.
There's something very special about this place, and it really does almost draw you to come back and spend longer.
Myriad waterway routes in the Boreal Forest, very wild, an area larger than Quetico and the Boundary Waters put together, that sees only a small fraction of the amount of visitors that those areas do.
I just thought, I can contribute to this. Let's go.
People always ask me, well, why do you do that? It's hard work and stuff like that. And you know, it's just, there's something satisfying about it, and the things that you see, the beauty that's out there, and it's a challenge. You know, there's no doubt that that's part of it too.
That whole learning process of putting the training into action was just really personally satisfying.
I think it's really nice to connect with other people who care about these things, right? And who like going out canoeing as well.
We had never been on a group trip like this ever before in our life. To be able to be out there and experiencing that together with others who have a very similar or interest and passion for that, not only the project, but just that experience and being out there, those are moments that really stay with you.
You're pretty likely to meet some great people.
I've always, explored different places. This weird had a purpose. Do get into the bush a little bit and wander around. If you pay attention, there's things out there, but yeah, you gotta sometimes get off the trail a little bit.
There's something about just being in the habitat, the territory of these creatures, somewhere where a caribou had her calf, that's pretty cool just to imagine them actually there. And feeling so lucky that we share the earth with them.
Ray and I, bushwhacking.
We did find evidence in a couple different spots. It was like, okay, I can see this perfect. It was more open and mossy, and the lichens were everywhere. You learn, and you think outside the box a little bit. So.
Could very well be. Could very well be.
You learned how to really look more closely at the terrain, and to me it's always a joy to start to see new things. It was an unusual amount of delight to find scat.
The black flies, the mosquitoes, the challenges of the actual groundwork, and camping, dealing with rain, storms, wind, all those things.
You could not only feel like there was something very practical and tangible and a purpose of the trip, you could become more immersed in the whole boreal forest wilderness. Oftentimes you're just in awe of just the vastness of it, but then to really focus in when you're, head down and looking for caribou scat or pellets, and the excitement of seeing something like that and realizing, wow, there's not only evidence here, but you just feel, I guess, a greater sense of in touch with part of the landscape and part of the wildlife, and specifically the caribou.
I love seeing new areas, new lakes, new routes that I haven't been on. And in this case, of course, it's caribou habitat.
To experience and witness a caribou for the very first time in our lives, the excitement, the fumbling around, and try to figure out how to zoom in and all of this. Meanwhile, my partner, she's in the front of the canoe holding on to a branch and just kind of freaking out. She's so excited she can't contain her excitement, and they're just swimming, motoring across the front of us.
If you want something different and want to feel like you're helping the planet or the caribou, there's no doubt that this is worth it for me. I mean, I can attest to that.
So hopefully that gives you a picture of what the experience was like for volunteers on our trips last summer. Again, this year, our survey trips will take place in July and August. Because calving takes place earlier in the spring, it's important for us to wait until July to begin surveying. Again, to minimize disturbance to cow and calf caribou. And on the tail end of things, we don't want to be surveying too late in the year when that evidence we're looking for might begin to be a bit degraded. If you've encountered Wabakimi black flies in May or June in the past, I'm sure you won't be too disappointed that we're required to avoid those months of the year. Most of the trips will be 7 to 10 days in length. The length of the trip will depend on the location and how the team decides to access the survey lake. At most target areas, teams will likely need 4 to 6 days to survey the area. And then on top of that, the team will need to build in time at the beginning and end for accessing the target lake, whether that's by paddling in with a vehicle shuttle or by train or by flying in. The method of accessing the lake can be determined by the team, depending on the team member's interest, the time you have, willingness to cover the costs, and of course, the location itself may dictate how you need to get there. Some of the lakes this year will have the possibility of access by train. The teams will need to build time into their plan for finding or sometimes establishing a campsite in some locations that are off the regularly traveled canoe routes. And of course, as like any trip in Wabakimi, we'll need to anticipate bad weather days or windbound days that might slow them down. Most teams will base camp at 1 or perhaps 2 different locations on a lake and then fan out from there to conduct the surveys. So for the most part, there won't be long distances to travel. Teams will be focused on one lake or on one part of a lake, even in some instances, and spend time surveying that area fairly intensively. Of course, the main focus of the survey trips is to collect data, and I'll get into what evidence of caribou we're looking for in a minute. Every trip will be different, but generally, surveyors, volunteers should expect to spend 5 to 6 hours surveying on most days after arriving at the target lake. The surveyors will be given a map of the target area with suggested survey sites identified on the map already. And the sites are chosen based on habitat characteristics and geographic locations that are the caribou's preferred habitat. So islands, peninsulas, beaches. But once surveyors are on the ground, the terrain can sometimes look different than it does on a topo map or on the satellite image. So that will be part of the training that we do in the spring, that surveyors will then use their own judgment and their training to choose the locations that they'll survey in order to get good coverage of that target area. The surveys will take you places in the boreal forest that you likely never would have ventured into. Even the most avid paddler doesn't tend to go bushwhacking across islands through the forest regularly. Of course, there are not always good landings. That's going to mean wet feet, slippery rocks, and then of course bushwhacking on uneven terrain to get around the survey point and get around the area. And then finally, volunteers will receive all the training that they need and the basic equipment needed to carry out the surveys, following a standardized protocol that has been developed by our Science Advisory Board and recording that information on a standard data sheet. So this is what a survey looks like, or the beginning of it at least. To conduct a survey, surveyors begin by paddling around the island or along the shore of a peninsula in order to find a suitable place to land, a place that is going to provide easy access for the caribou. That's where caribou would likely get out of the water or get into the water, such as a beach or a low unobstructed path, And it's also going to be a reasonable place to land a canoe. And then the search begins. So once on land, surveyors document their location using a GPS, and then head off to walk either around the island or around the edges of the peninsula looking for evidence of caribou. And so what exactly is that evidence that we're looking for? Well, while it's not the most glamorous of the findings, pellets or scat are the most abundant type of evidence that we found last year, and most likely the most abundant thing that we'll find going forward. Last year, 2/3 of the sites with evidence of caribou had pellets at them. You can see the ruler in the top left corner, top left photo. Using the size of the pellets, we can determine if they're from adult, yearling, or calf caribou. And we can also determine how old the pellets are by looking at how wet or dry they are, whether they're decomposing or still very fresh. And that helps us to say whether the caribou have used the site recently or not. Another piece of evidence we're looking for is bedding areas. The bedding areas often have other evidence as well, like pellets, evidence of lichen forage, caribou hair, as you can see in these bottom two photos, that kind of white straw-like stuff in the middle of the photo is hair tracks, game trails that can provide a sense of how well used the bedding area is, and perhaps even the female shed antler, which I'll explain momentarily. A little bit of caribou behavior here around the bedding areas. After the female caribou gives birth, the first task for that newborn calf is to gain enough strength to move around, and specifically to learn to swim. That's what a huge skill for them in terms of survival. Within a week or 10 days, the cow and calf are typically mobile enough to move around between islands or from mainland to island, which provides greater safety for the young calf being able to shift their location. So a cow and calf are using multiple sites, bedding sites, within a relatively small geographic area as the calf grows in its first couple of months. So to give you an idea of what one of these areas could look like, and a bit more about what a survey looks like, I want to share a little video tour that from video clips we took last summer at a bedding site that we found. Here we've got a bed where a caribou has laid down. You can see it's packed down, trampled down there, and there's some traces of fur left behind.
The other thing we get at this site here is a nice view of the water. So if the mama caribou is surveying its surroundings, it's got a nice view of everything coming here from the water side.
So here we have adult winter pellets. They're sort of worked into the moss and lichen, partially covered by leaves, and they're quite dry. You probably noticed in that video that in those more upland areas, the ground is typically covered in moss and lichen. And so detecting tracks, which is something else we're looking for, is quite difficult. Tracks are most often visible on beaches, both because the caribou like the beaches and because they're just easier to identify in wet sand than in other substrates like moss or lichen. And so this is a priority stop for surveys that will try to visit all the beaches around the edges of lakes. Now, in terms of antlers, we're also looking for antlers. Caribou have some amazing adaptations, and one compelling example of how deeply caribou are intertwined with their habitat is the growth of their antlers. Male caribou begin growing their antlers in March, growing quite quickly from May to July, and they're completely hardened off by mid-September. They keep their antlers until after the rut in November, when they no longer need to show off or compete for mates during the mating season, and males will shed their antlers and spend the winters without. Female caribou develop smaller antlers from June to September, and pregnant females will keep the antlers throughout the winter and will use them to defend food sources that are critical to them during their pregnancy. A pregnant female will lose her antlers within days after calving, triggered by hormonal changes. So that is something that we're looking for, is a female antler shed at bedding areas. Females who are not pregnant will lose their antlers earlier in the winter, meaning that the only caribou with antlers through the bulk of the winter and spring months are those pregnant females. And so they have this advantage over other caribou to defend those critical food sources that they need to successfully calve. Antlers can grow up to 2.5 centimeters or an inch a day at their peak growth, which takes, as you can imagine, just enormous resources from the body and energy for the caribou. And they will actually use nutrients from other parts of their bodies to do this. And so this occurs during prime forage season in the summer, when the animals have good access to food and they can still replace the nutrients that they need for this antler growth. And then finally, another very cool adaptation, or the way that the timing all works of their antler growth, is that the velvet, under the velvet on a developing antler, is a network of thousands of tiny blood vessels which feed and allow the tissue to grow so fast. What that also does is the blood vessels act as an air conditioner during that time of peak growth, which of course is during the hottest days of the summer, as the animals will lose heat through that blood circulating all over the surface of the antler. So we didn't find any antlers last summer, but it is something that we'll continue to look for this year. And of course, what we're all hoping for is to be lucky enough to actually spot some caribou. Now, for those of you intrigued by the idea of participating in a trip, these are the volunteer requirements. So volunteers need a minimum amount of experience in a remote canoe trip setting of 2 or more wilderness trips of 5 or more days in length, but more is strongly preferred. If you're not sure if you've got the right kind of experience, I'd be happy to chat more with you about this. Volunteers should be 18 years of age or older, and there's a level of physical fitness that you'll need, as those things that I mentioned. You can expect to be bushwhacking, uneven terrain, slippery and rough landings, and just the regular canoe trip things like portages and paddling for good chunks of the day. Volunteers need to be prepared to complete all of the mandatory training requirements and cover the cost of the trip. 2 or more members of each group need to have wilderness first aid training. Of course, We know Wabakimi is a remote area. This is not a guided trip, and despite our access to satellite communication, of course, on a trip, you need to be prepared to manage an emergency situation until you can get help. You may apply as an individual or as a pair with a paddling partner, or if you have a group of 4, that's our goal, is to have groups of 4 in the end. You can apply all ready to go together, which may be the simplest thing in terms of coordinating logistics. However, we are expecting to group individuals who apply into groups of people who are able to travel at the same time. Volunteers will be selected based on experience and aptitude for this kind of travel, as well as I mentioned, those logistical issues like your availability and scheduling, and just the ability to match you with others who have the same availability. Once selected, volunteers will be required to complete some online training. We will have a group training date later in the spring, so you understand the protocol, know how to use the equipment, and to make sure your group as a whole is prepared to embark on your trip. As with any personal canoe trip, you'll need to plan on dedicating some time to organizing with your group before you head out on your trip. And then after your trip, you will need to plan to dedicate, again, a bit of time to making sure all of the data sheets are returned and returning the equipment and submitting the evidence photos. And this is a critical part of the whole thing. We need to get the data back from you to make sure that all of your efforts are counted and end up in that database. So one way to look at this is that organizationally, it's the same as planning for a personal canoe trip, but this time it just has a very specific purpose. Volunteers are responsible for providing all of your own food, camping gear, canoeing gear, and a camera or phone with which to take photos of the caribou evidence that you find. And then you'll work with your group members to organize the equipment, your group equipment, plan your logistics and all of the details of your trip. The project will provide the equipment needed for conducting the surveys, which includes a map of the survey area, a field kit with the basic equipment that you'll need, and a GPS inReach device for regular check-in communication, for marking waypoints, and of course for use in case of an emergency. And then you'll also receive all of the training that you'll need before your trip. The project is funded by a grant from the Caribou Conservation Stewardship Program, a program of the Government of Ontario. We do have limited funds available to reimburse specific travel expenses for volunteers participating in survey trips up to a predetermined limit per person. So we would love to hear from you if you're interested in volunteering. The application is now open on the Friends of Wabakimi website, and we have already received many applications. They are being reviewed as they are received. So if you haven't applied already and you're interested, I would encourage you to apply as soon as possible, and or reach out with questions if you have any. Our volunteer selection will take place throughout the coming weeks and continue on until spaces are filled. We want to give everyone as much time as possible to do all the training and preparations and planning for your trips. The training webinar and group meetings will take place in April and May, so that final preparations can happen in June. And then of course, trips will start heading out in July. Now, if you don't have to be on one of our survey trips for your caribou sightings to make a difference. In addition to the on-the-ground surveys, we're promoting the use of iNaturalist to document caribou sightings in Wabakimi. iNaturalist is a hugely valuable tool to collect species observation data that can be used by researchers. It promotes engagement in community science, and for us, it allows far more wilderness canoeists to collect data from a wider geographic area than we could ever cover on our survey trips. we know that a survey trip's not going to be for everyone, but lots of folks are out there paddling and may encounter evidence of caribou. And so we encourage anyone who submits an observation to add it to 2 projects on iNaturalist. The top box here on the right is the Wabakimi Boreal Caribou Citizen Monitoring Project. And then also, if you can submit it to the NHIC's Rare Species of Ontario project, that'll make sure that it gets into the official provincial records. These are just a few of the observations that have been made so far and submitted to our project. If you're not familiar with iNaturalist, you can find instructions on the Friends of Wabakimi website for some specific details, like how to set your licensing information so that the data you submit can be used by researchers, how to join these projects if you're not familiar with that, and how to create an observation when you're offline, like on a canoe trip, for example, so that you can upload it later. So we're nearly wrapped up. I'm about to hand it over to you and see if we've got any questions. But last but certainly not least, before I do that, I just want to point out that, as is the case with many conservation issues, caribou conservation is not only about having the right data to guide decision making, it's also heavily affected by policy. And so this is part of the reason that education and having people learn about what some of the issues are is important for our project. There are many organizations, both in Canada and in the United States, that are working for caribou conservation by tackling different dimensions of the issue through research and education and policy advocacy. And so I would strongly encourage you to look up these organizations, learn about what they're doing. You can learn more about caribou, find out about how you can be involved or support the work that they're doing as well. So with that, I'm going to see if we've got any questions.
Kate, would you like me to read off some that were?
That'd be
Okay. First question was, you don't report lakes where caribou are seen, but I believe the sightings exist in the public domain on iNaturalist. Is there a way to protect iNaturalist sightings, i.e. allow access only to researchers and not to the public?
Yeah, good question. I don't think there's a limit or a way to limit the observation only to researchers. However, when you do enter your observation in iNaturalist, there is a place to add a buffer around the observation. There's specific instructions that's included in the instructions on the FOW instructions and on the FOW website. So have a look at that. But if you add that buffer, then that just puts the observation on the iNaturalist map as a circle rather than a point. Caribou are moving around, so it's important that we don't identify those calving beds, that very specific point. If you happen to see a caribou swimming across a lake, the buffer isn't massive. It's not covering all of Wabakimi or anything. We know that we're identifying some lakes by adding them in there. But that does kind of broaden the scope of it a little bit so that it's not pinpointing an exact spot. And that just adds a little bit of protection for them.
Okay. Are dogs going to be allowed to go on the trip? We haven't had that question yet.
We haven't had that question. We haven't had that question, but my feeling is that it would be these are sensitive locations that we're going to, and we're being extra cautious not to disturb the caribou when we're going out. So, we're going out specifically looking for the animals and places where they might have been and where they could potentially still be in that area. So off the top of my head, I'm going to say it's probably not the best plan, just because bringing a dog into that mix with the caribou is potentially going to cause some disturbance to them.
Okay. Can you speak to your opinion about how powerful, accurate, whoops, it jumped on me, accurate current data is in the fight for caribou habitat protection from powerful interests like forestry?
Yeah, that's it's a really big issue and a really complicated issue, and that's, I'll say, why I pointed out that there's other organizations working on advocacy around policy as well. Those things are really important as well, that those policy issues are some of the things that are going to make the difference in some places. Having information about what areas are really important for caribou right now and documenting where they are allows us to add to that database and know that we've documented the current situation and the current kind of, it's sort of taking a census of what's there right now and allowing better arguments for those specific places. As a broad issue, we know that there are policy issues that that need to be addressed, and as you say, there's powerful interests like forestry that are going to have to be part of the fix as well. So we're adding information and adding data where data is missing currently. There's not a lot of current data in the particular areas where we're looking. So we're sort of working at a small scale in terms of filling a gap in an area where there isn't a lot of data. And that allows us to, as we said, comment on those forest management plans in those areas. It allows for very specific, we're, as I pointed out on the maps, that caribou are covering such a huge area that there are bigger changes that need to be made as well. But this is helping to inform decisions on a small scale in these particular areas. I hope that sort of answers the question. I think it's not the only thing that's going to help caribou. There's other things that are needed as well, but it is contributing to the overall conservation effort.
And that's what we can do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm not sure if this question is for the project or it's broader. I'm not sure. This person asks, they've heard of people taking the train into the Wabakimi with their canoes. Can you access this train near Barrie? And I'm not even sure I'm saying that right.
Barrie, Ontario.
Okay.
To be honest, I don't know what the closest stop to Barrie would be. It might be Sudbury. But you could take the train from Toronto to Sudbury. So I don't know exactly. You'd have to check the via schedule a route to do that. But it would be possible to get on not too far from Barrie. Yeah.
And yes, you can take your canoes on
Right.
if you arrange for it. It can be tricky but it is possible to do that. Okay, next question is, you mentioned 4 people in a survey group on the trip. Is that the limit, or can you have more in the group?
We're aiming for 4, but we might consider, there's potential for considering probably 6. One limitation is that some of the lakes that we're accessing are not on regular canoe routes. So, and some of them are more remote places that don't have well-established campsites. We're trying to have as little impact as possible, and just logistically, we want to make these trips feasible. So keeping the numbers reasonable kind of fits in with that. But that's something we could discuss, and I'd be happy to send an email with that question and what you're thinking about, and we could chat more about that.
Okay, let's see. Based on feedback, what were the biggest challenges last year's volunteer groups faced?
Last summer, there were some sort of last minute changes that happened. It was both the first year of the project, and of course, we always need to anticipate last minute changes on planning a canoe trip. There were some changes to access, so well, there was a missing portage for one group so we did change a route a little bit to manage that, and another group wasn't able to fly in at the last minute and ended up needing to paddle in, and they adapted very quickly to that. So I think those were probably the biggest challenges in terms of logistics. In terms of the surveys themselves, or doing the data gathering, I think probably the feedback was that there's a little bit of a learning curve. It's I mean, the video shows pretty well what's involved. It's not complicated, but we spent a little bit of time at the beginning of the trip doing some training together, and going out and doing kind of a trial survey and looking at some of the pellets that we saw and sort of assessing them together, and those were helpful things. So those are things that we're working into the training going forward.
Okay, next one is my partner and I are hoping to do a personal trip late May, early June. We would love to contribute to the iNaturalist app, but I'm afraid of disturbing moms and calves. What tips do you have for us to avoid causing harm?
Yeah, good question. I think if you encounter caribou, you just need to back away from them and try to avoid them. As I pointed out, most people aren't crashing around in the bush on your canoe trip. You'll probably be on portages and on campsites, and those are not likely the places that you're going to encounter the caribou. So just being, if you do happen to see them, giving them lots of space and backing off so that you don't disturb them would be the best thing that you could do in that situation.
Good. Next is, can you assist with getting the necessary permits, like which website or who to call to get the right permit?
Yeah, the permits that most of our trips won't be in the provincial park, so you won't need park permits. There are non-resident Crown land camping permits that are required, and we're working on getting an exemption. There's exemptions that are possible for charitable organizations or non-profit organizations working on this type of project. So that's something that's underway, and we'll certainly help you with that. Yeah.
Okay. To confirm what you said earlier, the survey sites have already been determined, but is it up to the volunteer team to plan the logistics for accessing those survey sites, including base camp locations?
Yes, that is correct. So we will tell you the survey lake that we want you to cover, as well as provide a map with the survey sites, potential survey sites marked out on it. Most teams will be able to visit each of those survey sites that are marked on the map. If you get to the lake and find that there's based on the training, you see a location that's not marked on your map, but you think it's a good place to survey, it's good potential caribou habitat, then that's where we ask you to use your judgment and your training to choose that location. It also might be that if you have bad weather or things just take longer than expected, that you might not get to every point that's on the map. And so again, you can use your judgment to plan for where to go. It is also up to the team to plan the logistics of the trip. So plan your train or your paddle in or flight, make arrangements with outfitters. We are certainly happy to help with some of those things and provide guidance, and if necessary, answer questions absolutely, we're happy to help with those things, but that's for the team to take on themselves.
Oh, and that would include, because you mentioned base camp locations. In
Yeah.
some cases, there may not be an established camp and they would have to establish one themselves.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
that's right.
okay. Will there be a group leader in each team who is knowledgeable about the project survey protocols and can help the other volunteers?
There will be a group leader. The leader won't necessarily be someone who's already been on a trip last year or has specific training, but we will ask that leader to be sure that they're comfortable with the protocols to sort of lead the rest of the group in that. And we will have more opportunities or plenty of opportunities in the spring to make sure that the whole team, but as well as the group leader are comfortable with those protocols.
Next one is, if an individual embarks on a solo trip in an area outside of this year's designated survey region, would FOW still benefit from this data?
Absolutely. We would certainly appreciate you reporting the data. The best way to do that is through iNaturalist. So join both of the Friends of Wabakimi iNaturalist project and the NHIC Rare Species of Ontario iNaturalist project. And when you report your observation, add it to both of those projects. That's the best way for us to get that information.
If I apply and summer plans change and won't be able to come out to the trip anymore, how much of an issue will this be?
I mean, the rest of we're going to put teams together and everyone's going to be, you're going to be planning your trip together. So it could potentially be an issue. So would be best if once you've committed to it, if you can do your best. Of course, things, unexpected things happen, but please, if you've applied and said committed to participating in a trip, please do your best to follow through with that. We don't want to compromise the whole trip for other people. We're going to try to have a few backup people available, but Wabakimi is a long way from most places. So we want people to be able to participate. If you commit to it, it's a bit of a hard ask to get someone there in a short timeline to fill in for someone else.
Okay, as for the train near Barrie, there is a Via Rail stop in oh, that was a response. I do believe that this is on the same rail line that goes through Wabakimi. Okay, Washaga was the person, what they said. Okay, other questions? That's the end of what's written there. If you have a question, you want to do it verbally, just unmute yourself and chime in. And
Well,
Kate,
thank you very much, everyone. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. You can email, and I'm happy to chat if you're interested in volunteering or if you have other questions about the project. I've got one last slide here I'll share.
yes, our next webinar.
That is, yeah.
Expanding protected areas in Northern Ontario, February 23rd. We hope you can join us for that. And we will be at all of these shows talking about this project. Kate, thank you so much for all your efforts and for leading everything. Oh, one last thing says, where can we access the recording of this webinar? We will be posting it on our website. I can't remember if we're placing it with all the other webinars or if we're placing it with the actual project information, but it'll be in one of those two places.
Yeah, well, certainly, if it's not in with the project information will link to it from there, so you'll be able to find it there too. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.